I have already made a video on the most common pro-choice tough questions found in the description box, but this is my second video on the topic of abortion. I do not believe in the so-called silence from the scriptures, but rather some are just silent to hear from the scriptures. You know, there's something that all of us have that's built into all of us, I believe has been overlooked at some extent in this debate. That is our conscience. According to the scriptures, the excuse of the Bible is silent on any matter is not an excuse when your conscience is saying no. Romans chapter 2 verses 14 and 15 states, even Gentiles who do not have God's written law, so they know his law when they instinctively obey it, even without having heard it. They demonstrate that God's law is written in their hearts for their own conscience and thoughts, either accuse them or tell them they are doing right. All of us have been given a conscience to act as a law within our hearts. If one's conscience is saying no to abortion, then if you reject that, it will lead you to doing other things that you know are wrong. I heard it's been said that killing the very first time is hard, but it gets easier as you do it. Yet there is more to this debate than our conscience. Yet I will argue as the main scriptural reason why abortion is wrong is found in Genesis chapter 9, verse 6. If anyone takes a human life, that person's life will also be taken by human hands. The reason is the last part of the verse. For God made human beings in his own image. This is the reason why all of us should rethink abortion as a Christian. The reason why we don't kill is because man was made in the image of God. But what exactly does that mean? I will develop that as we go. To me, this is the primary view of why the abortion is wrong according to the scriptures. But before I tackle that, I want to address a few references and then build my case. What is considered the most direct reference to abortion in the Bible is Exodus chapter 21, verses 22 and 23. From the New Living Translation, it states, Now suppose two men are fighting, and in the process they accidentally strike a pregnant woman, so she gives birth prematurely. If no further injury results, the man who struck the woman must pay the amount of compensation the woman's husband demands, and the judges approve. But if there is further injury, the punishment must match the injury, a life for a life. That's how one side will see it. Yet others will argue that this passage is really saying if the mother has a miscarriage, there will be a fine, and if the mother dies, only then is it life for life. The problem is depending on what translation you use. Some translations will translate it as premature birth and others as a miscarriage. Yet others will translate it if the child comes out from her, which actually is the literal translation, but simply reading that, we can't clarify if the child is alive or not. So here's my question on both sides of the debate. If this passage did not exist, what two passages from the Bible support your position? I will give my reasons from the scriptures why abortion is wrong. However, those that believe abortion is permissible must provide at least two passages that will support their position. Remember, Bible doctrine is based on two or more witnesses in order for it to be established. If you truly believe that this is the one verse that proves that abortion is permissible, then your case is very weak. Remember, while abortion is premeditated, this passage is speaking of something in the heat of the moment. There's no premeditation here. If that is all you got, you really don't have a case. However, I will consider making a separate video on what this passage really means. It just would take too much time to cover it now because I have a lot to cover, and I believe I have a clear case against abortion according to the scriptures without even the need of this passage. Next, have you considered the practice of the passing through the fire? In Leviticus 18:21, it says, "Do not permit any of your children to be offered as a sacrifice to Moloch." Now, quote, "The image of Moloch was a human figure with a bull's head and outstretched arms, ready to receive the children destined for sacrifice. The image of metal was heated red hot by a fire kindled within, and the children laid on its arms rolled off into the fiery pit below. In order to drown the cries of the victims, flutes were played and drums were beaten, and mothers stood by without tears or sobs, to give the impression of the voluntary character of the offering," end quote. Now, critics will claim that no one that gets abortion today is crying out to Moloch, and some don't even believe that there is a God to cry out to. So why in the world are you bringing this passage in this debate? Well, for one good reason. What the children of Israel did in the worship of Moloch wasn't just idolatrous, but the worst form of child abuse to the children that have already been born. Abortion, on the other hand, should be viewed as the worst form of child abuse to the unborn. Let me present the case of the unborn according to the scriptures. Okay, we already had mentioned about the conscience. That's something to consider, but let's get into the scriptures. Number one, God's personal involvement. Consider this passage in Job chapter 10, verse 10. "Thou hast poured me out as milk and curdled me like cheese." That very first part where it says, "Thou hast not poured me out as milk," this speaks of the way a woman gets pregnant. Quote, "When semen is first ejaculated, it comes out as a gel, which gradually turns to a liquid. The semen analyst measures how long it takes the semen to become a liquid, normally 20 minutes, unquote. So the gel from us guys could not travel very far, but in a liquid form, it can about 9 miles needed to reach the egg. In the Hebrew, the word pour means to flow forth. By implication, liquefy. So stage one, the sperm meets the egg. The gel turns into liquid that literally flows like milk to meet the egg. Yet the second part of the passage says, "and curdled me like cheese." If you think of it, the word curdle means separate or cause to separate into curds or lumps. That one cell at conception will then separate into 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, etc. cells, and thus what some will call a clump of cells. After this, the cells will begin to be grouped into different groups of cells, and like an orchestra will develop the skin, flesh, bones, and muscles without missing a beat. Check out this translation in Job 10, verses 10 and 11. "You formed me inside my mother like cheese formed from milk. You dressed me with skin and flesh. You sewed me together with bones and muscles." When a doctor does a major surgery, there are strict rules of who is involved, the way the procedure is to be done, the proper sterilization of the equipment, and the assurance that nothing from the outside can tamper with the operation in any way are just some of the key factors. So God is involved in the development of the child as a master surgeon. If a doctor demands, and rightfully so, strict guidelines for an operation, then by what authority, according to the scriptures, does anyone have the right to compromise the authorized personnel-only room known as the womb to be tampered with? If abortion was meant to be an option in family planning, then why did God go through so much trouble in making the womb a restricted area for the baby to grow? Who authorize man to tamper with that only God is authorized to be involved in according to the principles found in his word. But this is not the only account of the formation process. Psalms chapter 139 verses 13 through 16. Now, I'm going to put up on the screen the King James Version of these passages and take the literal Hebrew meanings of some of the key words and then paraphrase what these passages are revealing. Beginning in verse 13, "For thou hast clothed me like a garment, my inner self, which includes my mind, thou hast entwined me as a screen in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Marvelous are thy works, and that my soul knoweth right well. My body was not hid from thee when I was made in secret. I was woven together in the lower parts of the earth. Thine eyes did see a wrapped and unformed mass, implying as the embryo." And by the way, just as Genesis states that the earth was without form and void. "And in thy books all my members were written, which in continuance were fashioned, where as yet there was none of them." The key to remember from these passages is that God has an intimate involvement in the process. And let me ask this question: what gives you the right to meddle into that which is none of your business? Second, consider the personhood of the unborn declared 3,000 years before it became an issue in our courts today. The view of personhood in King David. Psalms 139, as we've been looking at, verses 13 through 16. The core argument by abortion rights advocates is that the unborn are not a person. To me, that's not really an argument, because why should that matter if it fits the definition of person? Why should that change whether they have rights or not? There's no real core argument that really goes into detail concerning that. But even the Supreme Court agreed that if the fetus had been proven to be a person, quote, "if this suggestion of personhood is established, the appellate's case, of course, collapses, for the fetus' right to life would then be guaranteed specifically by the amendment," end quote. Now, I will now read from the New Living Translations, and notice the emphasis that I'm going to put concerning personhood. 11 personal pronouns in just a few verses. 3,000 years ago, King David nailed it on the personhood issue of today. Quote, verse 13, "You made all the delicate inward parts of my body and knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous. How well I know it. You watched me as I was being formed in utter seclusion, as I was woven together in the dark of the womb. You saw me before I was born. Even every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed." I believe King David said that on purpose, as these scriptures foresaw the debate of personhood 3,000 years before it happened. This is the second part, I believe, because of God's view, but there is one more that I really want to hammer down. So many focus only on the physical development of the body, but there is more to a person that meets the eye. Third, the image of God, and this is the main reason why we should see abortion as wrong. We know God is involved in the development of the child, and to interrupt what God is doing, how can that not be wrong? Would you do that to a doctor? No. But yet, would you do that to a judge in a court? Cannot without consequences. And neither should it be with God. Third, the image of God. Jesus said God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. It is not our body, but our spirit that is made in the image of God. And that's what really needs to be focused on concerning the scriptures. The key to remember is the value that God places on his image. Jesus compared the value of many sparrows to that of a man. He also gave value even to a Roman coin because it had Caesar's image on it. Eagle eggs have a great value, and if you destroy them, you will suffer the consequences of that. Our value to God is not based on our development or function, but the exact moment during conception. We become an eternal spirit being created in the very image and likeness of God. The problem is only God truly can value a person from a proper perspective. And because of that perspective, he has declared the eternal value from that moment on, even if others don't. Though in the womb we are an eternal spirit being created in the image of God first. We have a soul and we live in a body. So you reside as a spirit, soul, and body in a temporary shelter called the womb. Once the body is developed enough, then the baby will initiate the birthing process. It is at this time that the separation of the unborn from the mother happens. Abortion, on the other hand, is the unauthorized separation of that temporary shelter. Think of it like a car accident in which the car gets totaled. I just went through that very recently. Just as a car will no longer function and fulfill its purpose as it was created to do so, the function of that person will no longer continue. How can someone who is pro-choice disregard God's intimate involvement in their own development in the womb, which includes a divine purpose and destiny, but will choose to have no regard for the unborn who are now in the very place of vulnerability that they once were? But check out this reference from Ecclesiastes 11:5 from the Living Translation. God's ways are as mysterious as the pathway of the wind, and as the manner in which a human spirit is infused into the little body of a baby while it is yet in the mother's womb. This should bring us back to the formation process in Psalms 139, where it says the word entwine means of two or more things to twine together. Thou hast covered or entwined me in my mother's womb. I want you to consider the following. First of all, we are an eternal spirit being that is infused or entwined with a soul and a body. And I believe that the timing of this is at conception. For in Psalms 51 verse 5, King David says, Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Since it is the eternal soul that sins. Now, animals are not sinners like men are, by the way. King David states that in sin my mother conceived me. So during conception, the spirit and soul are infused into the new body. And since King David said, in sin did my mother conceive me, then at conception, the spirit is infused with the soul and body. So to kill a fetus is not just to kill a clump of cells, but to destroy the precious entwining of the unborn spirit, soul, and body. Notice what the Apostle Paul stated in 1 Thessalonians 5:23. Now may the God of peace make you holy in every way, and may your whole spirit and soul and body be kept blameless until our Lord Jesus Christ comes again. Then notice what the author of the book of Hebrews states in Hebrews 4:12 from the Amplified Version. For the word that God speaks is alive and full of power, making it active, operative, energizing, and effective. It is sharper than any two-edged sword, penetrating to, listen to this, the dividing line of the breath of life, the soul, the immortal spirit, and of the joints and marrows of the deepest parts of our nature, exposing and shifting and analyzing and judging the very thoughts and purposes of the heart. God knows where the dividing line is between our spirit, soul, and body. He knows how that entwining is to go. Thus, that would mean he knows how to entwine them together that not even the most skilled doctor can do. I mean, have you considered what some DNA might be considered as junk? Just might be that which creates and develops the invisible aspect of what makes us human. In fact, in Luke chapter 16, verses 19 through 31, it speaks of the rich man that had died and gone to hell. Now, his body was dead, but his spirit and soul were very much aware and in torment. His reality was not based solely on having a body or what development or how bad it was now deceased, but because his spirit and soul was alive, he was made aware. And thus, what he experienced was very real. A person cannot see electricity, but they can cause havoc when they use it improperly. A person cannot see the unseen damage an abortion does, but God can. Second, God also has a destiny for all. Jeremiah 1:5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew and approved of you as my chosen instrument. And before you were born, I separated and set you apart, consecrating you, and I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Notice that God knew you before you were formed in the womb with a purpose and destiny. Now, have you considered the possibility that you, as a spirit being, were waiting for the right body to be infused in? Just a thought to consider. Finally, abortion is not just the killing of a mass or a clump of cells, but the willful disgrading and dishonoring of the very image of God. Next, have you considered that abortion is the reverse of God's creative order? Abortion not only kills the child, but attempts to override the creative order of God. God is a God of order. For even in the Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost are three persons in one. God the Father is the head of the Trinity, but the Son and Holy Spirit are equal to the Father, but the roles are different. This in no way restricts Jesus or the Holy Spirit in teaching, saving souls, miracles, etc., but it does show that God is a God of order. Now, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, the Apostle Paul dealt with a great error in the church. Now, I do a very detailed explanation about it in my video, Women in the Church Revised. However, what I want to state here is the following. Though both men and women are equally created in the image of God, there still needs to be order. That is why the man is the head, even as God the Father is the head over Christ. In God's creative order, as well as in biology, the man decides what is best, even as the sperm from the father is the one that determines the sex of the child. And yet, men shouldn't talk about abortion, yet it's the man sperm that determines the sex. Yet in the city of Ephesus there was a following of the cult Artemis, called Diana in the King James, in which was believed that women were supreme and would even make men as captives. They would also kill men to their liking. When the Apostle Paul said, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, there was a particular type of error that he was referring to that has a connection to the very topic I'm speaking of now. Notice the word translated usurp authority actually means, quote, someone guilty of killing his or her own flesh and blood, end quote. So the error that the Apostle Paul dealt with was not referring to whether a woman can have a place of teaching or authority in general, but that which usurps the proper God-given authority. This is in no way referring to the man lording over a woman and being a hard taskmaster, but seeks to make a man a sissy, in which the woman alone wears the pants. Though some will say, we don't worship Artemis today, it is the same spirit of error with the same intentions, and it's like a wolf in sheep's clothing. In fact, the Supreme Court has declared that the ancient era of the cult Artemis, keep this in mind if you go to see Wonder Woman in the theaters, is backed by the Constitution according to the court's opinion. And yet they have no clue that they are falling right into this particular era. Quote, that the woman's right is absolute and that she is entitled to terminate her pregnancy at whatever time, in whatever way, and for whatever reason she alone chooses. End quote. Those involved in this heresy of pro-choice are allowing the woman to usurp the authority over the man and literally fulfill, quote, someone guilty of killing his or her own flesh and blood, end quote. So not only is abortion murder, tampering with that which is restricted by God, but attempts to usurp the very creative order of God. But what is so amazing to me in the 1 Timothy passage, that Paul's answer to this woman that was in error was to have a child. God has made all provision necessary for all children he creates. It is man that sometimes has robbed a child of those necessities. But in abortion, they have robbed the very chance for the baby to live. To those women who have had an abortion, God is there to forgive you and to love you. Though we can't take back anything that was done, we can break the chain of this mindset. In conclusion, I want you to consider that all of us have a call of God on our life. As a Christian, we should know that without a shadow of doubt, our purpose to which we are called to. I just want you to consider this. Even though we're talking about abortion, I would really encourage you that to examine your own heart, that in other things we are not allowing abortions to happen. Because abortion is a determination of a pregnancy, of something that is growing and something that is alive. And my one exhortation is that your relationship with God, make sure that you or somebody doesn't influence you in terminating a growing relationship with God and in a growing relationship with your spouse or with your children, with your family, with your church. The mindset of abortion is not just on this issue, but that we would allow the mind of Christ to so overtake us that we would not be so quick to terminate what God is doing in our lives when things get hard, but that we be willing to go through the travail and allow God to birth that which is not only alive, but that which can reproduce. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says, yet God has made everything beautiful for its own time. He has planted eternity in the human heart. But even so, people cannot see the whole scope of God's work from the beginning to the end. That's why we need to trust in Him and not allow this mindset to be deeply enrooted in us.